Life was as same as it never was. That was a lesson Demetria Jewel Hilton had learnt at a very young age. Having grown up rich as sin, she had everything money could buy, except the things which really mattered to her: friendship, loyalty, love. So when her marriage was arranged to Chase Landon, somebody who hated her very existence, she was doomed to live forever without love. The Unconventional Billionaire. Chase Landon had been born poor, but thanks to a fortunate turn of events, his family had joined the elite society, something which had torn them apart. Even after 10 years, he could not understand the hypocrisy which surrounded that fake and non-substantial world, everything Demetria Hilton was. He could hardly blame her, considering the environment she was born into. When he found himself forced to marry her, he was determined to oust her from his life. However, he had not bet on his plan backfiring on him. When the pretense fell apart, layer by layer, he found himself liking Demetria, something intolerable, of course. That didn't have to mean anything, though, had it? The beginning. It was her 15th birthday bash. Ineluctably, it was as grandiose as that of a princess, since nothing less would be tolerated. She was, after all, Demetria Jewel Hilton, the sole heiress to several billions of dollars. There was a scintillating fountain in the courtyard of the palace that her secretary had rented. The venue looked perfect, like something coming straight from her dreams, with the garden starting just at the end of the stairs and expanding to broad horizons of neatly trimmed, perfect grass laced with wild flowers. As she stood on the balcony of the second story, the lawn looked limitless, but at the horizon, the garden was less formal, ending with an avenue of cypresses. The picturesque outlook made her fingers itch and awakened the artistic painter dormant inside her. Although it was late evening, the scent that the flowers were emanating was invigorating. The magic, however, was tainted, the place being so crowded that even on the balcony there was no place for the fresh air to circulate. The music was loud enough to explode her ears, and her high heels were killing her. Many would believe that she would be used to wearing them, and besides, she was not supposed to show any weakness. Demetria Hilton was the hip, happening thing for most of her friends, and she had a reputation to maintain. That was what she had been taught since she was a kid anyway. Her nannies had never failed to remind her that she was a star, and not like some mediocre child that one might see around every street corner. Something which was supposed to make feel special, except that being rich had always made her feel like an outcast. She was not supposed to have fun like the others. She was not normal. She was supposed to always look classy and perfect. Sometimes it was tiring. Jaded, she scanned the room, her neck pivoting on her head in search of something, anything that would raise her interest, all in vain. The irony behind it all was that she didn't even know more than half of the people present at her own party. She knew most of them were here because of the feast and free gifts, and it was boring. She sighed. Everything bored her out of her mind. She should start doing drugs like all the other heiresses. It was not easy, being rich. It seemed so long since she'd acted on doing what she wanted instead of pretending to behave as expected of her. Someone bumped into her. She turned around frowning, hating the feel of the damp skin against hers, and she could take it no more. She was suffocating inside, and she needed some fresh air. She longed to inhale the pure scent of the flowers that were lining the big alley downstairs. Sneaking her way out, she picked a glass of champagne and made her way to the garden. Taking a tentative sip of the sparkling drink, she barely registered the taste of the alcohol and lost herself in the marvelous view the garden manifested. She almost wished it was daylight so that she could admire the beauty of the foliage around her. She made a mental decision to come and visit the place again as soon as possible when there was no crowd. As she walked down the line of trees, she felt her tension leave as she admired the flowers one by one. She was a real flower freak, and she always wanted to be a botanist. However, a botanist princess would never do. Her parents had told her sternly, even before she started to dream about her career. A princess was not supposed to have a career anyway. All she was supposed to do was look pretty even when she was at her lowest low. Filled with distaste at the thought of her parents, she resisted a grimace in case someone was watching, all the while trying not to care about the fact that they were in some other continent and had not even bothered to wish her on her special day. Instead, a week before, her mother's PA had phoned to remind her of the party. As she caressed a petal against her fingers, she felt herself relax and instantly felt better. She was not supposed to lament over her life like that. She was a privileged kid, and it was more than enough. More than anyone could ever wish for. Suddenly, she felt herself wishing for something that would drive away her loneliness. Something that would make her feel alive. "It's dangerous to be out here alone," someone breathed softly, and she whirled back, her heart nearly jumping out of her chest. She had been so lost in her thoughts that she had not even heard approaching footsteps. Fear gripped her immediately, since she was always exposed to danger. Ever since she was little, she had been told many times to avoid situations like that because she could be easily kidnapped. As her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she saw him for the first time. Tall, lean, and handsome. That was her first opinion of him. Although she could not make out his complete features, there was a certain charisma which oozed from him. It made her feel all mushy inside, something she had never ever felt for anyone else before. Finally, she realized that she was staring at him like a dumbass, and she recovered quickly from her shock, something that she had been trained to do. Face drawn with a plastered smile, she put on her mask, getting hold of her emotions as quick as possible, and pretended that she was not in the least affected by his presence. "It's just so lovely out here," she whispered, almost wishfully. Then she realized that she was not supposed to let onto any of her real self to the world, mentally scolding herself for the moment of respite. "I'm glad you like it, miss." Oh hell, he was asking her name? He did not know her? This had never happened to her before, since she was always recognized as a celebrity from afar. She decided to take advantage of the situation. Now was her time to be herself. "You can call me Dem," she smiled, trying to ignore the way her heart was beating. She was still in the shadows, and maybe that was why he could not recognize her. He was at her party, so there was no way he could not know who she was. "I'm Chase. Chase Landon," he introduced himself, approaching her, his face gleaming under the moonlight, and in that instant she could discern every little detail of him. She swore that it was the happiest moment of her life. Everything faded in the background as she stared at the most beautiful eyes she'd ever seen, a pair of piercing blue color shining around a light gray rim around the pupils. Endorsed with strong arched brows and eyelashes so thick that it should have looked ridiculous in a man, but made him captivating instead. All of it was framed by thick, warm, dark chocolate curls. His tight jaw was an angular shape that was filled with little stubbles, so perfectly masculine was the effect that Dem stood mesmerized. Then she frowned. What if it was a trap? "I have never seen you around before," she improvised haughtily. Surely he would not be able to guess that she was unable to recognize people from her very own party. He shrugged. "We've just moved to the city. My folks are living next door to the Hiltons," he indicated, with his head in the right direction as if showing her where he lived. There was a rough edge about him, something which she could not get hold of. Yet, she somehow knew he was nothing like the polished, spoilt brats she was used to. Then suddenly, it clicked. "Are you the new money who have recently arrived in the city?" she asked, unable to keep the antagonism out of her voice. Unfortunately, she knew the type too well. Too desperate to be accepted in the society. therefore too ready to compromise on their modest values and adapt to the newly defined artificial world. She knew the exact moment he picked up the barbed vibe in her voice. The change in him was phenomenal. His back went ramrod straight, his eyes turned completely blue, and the look he gave her could freeze hell. She felt like she wanted to weep at the loss of his initial warmth. It was like the clouds had chased the sunshine away from her life. Except she was made of much sterner stuff. Had to be if she wanted to survive in the fickle environment her parents had built around her. Nothing about her mattered. What mattered was who she was supposed to be. She was supposed to be a perfect princess with impeccable manners. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean it that way." She apologized instantly, plastering a fake smile on her face. She was so used to smiling when she had no intention to, that it had almost become a reflex to her. She had no idea how artificial she had become until he leaned closer to her. She got a better look of the 2 chips of ice facing her and tried not to flinch at the deadpan expression she saw there. "Miss Demetria Hilton, isn't it?" He sneered, putting emphasis on her first name to demonstrate that he had finally worked out who she was. Apparently, even he could put 2 and 2 together, inexorably coming up with 5. She found herself envying his ability to let free his emotions, even if it was contempt, pure, unfettered contempt. Please do not try to make amends about what you think, at least not if you don't mean it. She couldn't help it. She flinched at his discovery of her treachery and cringed at his ability to make her feel like a cheat. Then, as his next words registered, she was too mortified to defend herself. "You must consider yourself above everybody else, because you have been born rich, but in a few years' time, it wouldn't even matter." "All that matters is the money," he quipped with an inferred Southerner accent before disappearing in the darkness. Stunned, she remained immobile, paralyzed by his assumption that she was too much of a snob to welcome him because he had recently acquired wealth. Wealth did not matter. It was too insignificant to her. What mattered was the fact that he kept his integrity and survived in the cruel rich world. Chapter 1. The Marriage Blackmail. 9 years later. Chase Landon gaped unbelievably at the man sitting opposite him, trying hard to retain his fury. He clenched his fists tightly at his sides and felt the frustration of not being able to land a few punches on the face facing him. The only thing preventing him from doing so was not because he was not a violent person, but because the man sitting in front of him was his dear father. Without a word, he stood up, staring out the big corner window of his office, and for the first time, he was unable to enjoy the view. Usually, he loved watching the towering buildings with their lavish lights along Broad Street, one of the busiest streets in Philadelphia. It seemed that the shock of the recently delivered news rendered him impervious to the charm of the city. That was a first for him in 10 years, the time his family had moved from West Virginia to settle in one of the state's posh cities, to be among the rich, as his father so casually called them, never realizing that they would never be one of them, one of the rich. Oh, his family had the money all right, thanks to his father winning a lottery which had pioneered their move to a bigger city. Money was not an issue since his father had invested wisely, and over the years they had multiplied the amount they had initially won by tenfold. Chase could not help feeling cynical about the way society still treated them, like dirt. Not to their face, of course. Their world was too artificial to confront them with true feelings. Everything was said behind their backs. Chase was aware of every wagging tongue, hissing derogatory remarks in every social event his family attended, or of every female desperate to catch his attention only because he was rich, and when he ignored them, they would call him a poor rich. Now his father was trying to marry him off to one of them. No, not trying. Forcing. Chase could not hold back the rage threatening to explode inside him. It was not a fire recently lit. It was a wrath which had been kindled since 10 years ago, when everyone had refused to accept them as part of their world. They were always called the Landons in their snootiest tones, not in a flattering way, though. At first, he had believed that the snobs were shunning them only because they had just arrived in the city. With time, everybody would accept them as one of their own. Time and again, he'd been proven wrong. The rich society, the crème de la crème, would never accept them for who they were. Instead, they would always be judged on who they had been. Not that Chase was ashamed of who he had been. Back then, even if they had been poor, his family had been close, loving. Yet, after the acquisition of their first company, everyone had drifted apart. His father had become too desperate to make his place in the new world. His mother had become too desperate to remain the obedient wife, and his siblings had been too desperate to accommodate to their new lives. He had been too desperate to keep the family from disassembling, something inevitable now he could see. The family which had once been so close was now so broken that they barely spoke to each other, not unless it profited them in one way or another. Like now, his father approaching him after almost 4 months of absolute silence. Even now, he had not even bothered to ask him about his health or anything mundane. Peter Landon had no time for social niceties. He was one of the leading industrialists in the United States, rendering him so busy even for his own children. His father was here to order him to marry one of those heiresses because he believed it would be profitable for him and his business. Bitter regret filled him. He had always wanted to invest in his own company, but he had been so distracted by his family problems that he had never felt the time was right. Now to think that his own father was blackmailing to disinherit him if he did not marry one of those petty flamingos, he shivered in disgust at the thought. There was no one who looked like humans in that artificial crowd of females. With their long, slender necks, exaggerated clothing, and hairdos, they looked more like birds than any decent human being. His jaws clenched at the thought of living with one of them for the rest of his life. How dare his father put him in such a position? How could he let go of his hard work so easily? He had been the only one interested in building Landon Enterprise from scratch when his 5 brothers had escaped their family drama by running off to foreign countries. Chase had been the only one to stick around, the only one to believe that eventually family was paramount and he could save them. Not anymore. He was damned if he would give away his life to the rich people he hated the most. As if his father was following his line of thoughts, he heard him speak after a long, intangible pause. Think about it, Chase. It would finally give us the only thing we've lacked so far. We've come a long way, boy, he almost pleaded, while Chase refused to look back at him. For he knew he would see a desperate plea in his father's blue eyes, and it would be too easy to give in. Yes, his father was right. It would eventually give them leverage and place them on a higher position in the society Peter had almost lost his life to. Of course, the purer the breed of heiress, the higher in status they would go, yet he could not help but wonder who his father had in mind. Even if he knew he was not going to like it, he had a terrible premonition. He had just heard that some particular family was in financial trouble because of a previous bad deal, and he found himself wishing it was not her his father had in mind, not Demetria Jewel Hilton. In consternation, he closed his eyes when his father confirmed his worst suspicion. No way. Not her. She was the worst of the lot, the snobbiest of them all. Even her name was ridiculous. Who named their child Demetria Jewel? He could better understand his father's perspective, though. Chase was the only son he had left who was still humoring his whims, the only one who could pursue his dreams. Demetria Was an only child being filthy rich, or had been until Mr. Hilton had been betrayed by his best friend and business partner. They were now left with little capital, leaving them susceptible to the underlying vultures who might take this as an opportunity. So why not him, he wondered succinctly, and could have strangled himself at his moment of weakness. He should know better. The society would never accept his family, no matter what they did, even if it meant sacrificing his life for the purpose, because he was confident that tolerating a rich wife would be much harder than his strenuous teenage days short of money. He refused to become like his father, losing focus on meaningful things to end up with an unwanted family. Envisaging such a phlegmatic marriage was enough to give him the creeps, especially with Demetria Hilton. Even if she was perfect in every way, that did not matter to him. She was pretty. There was no mistake on that account. It was a contemporarily current practice among the women to undergo plastic surgery to enhance their features, and Dem would be no exception. She must have gone under the knife several times. In fact, they all did. After having encountered her at her birthday party, Chase had experienced a dose of her artifice and had vowed never to be near her again. She was pure poison to him, everything he detested in a woman. Rich, spoilt, and fake. From time to time he had caught sight of her during parties, had resolutely refused to be captivated by her synthetic beauty. Attraction meant nothing. She was someone he fancied too much for his own good. Apart from her looks and beauty, which were only skin deep, she seemed to be lacking in all the other departments. The one time he had approached her, she had been cold and calculating. Although some men would not give a damn about the character of a woman, preferring to focus on her beauty and wealth, he was somewhat different. He knew deep inside that he would be unable to spend his life with a doll instead of a real human being with feelings. Every now and then, her pictures appeared in flashy magazines, showing off her charity work or her many facetious actions. Following the latest trend, she was also active on social media once a month, always trying to be in the limelight. There had even been a scandal about her overdose of cocaine when she was 18, but her father had stifled the matter. Since then, there had been no disgrace, nothing, not even a boyfriend. Chase knew it was as fake as it got. It was impossible that someone of her beauty had no lovers at the age of 24. He had deduced that Miss Hilton had learnt her lessons well and had been more careful after that untoward incident. Suddenly, he realized that thinking of her had dissolved his anger. The initial rage he had felt when his father had announced to him the deplorable news seemed to have dissipated entirely. Chase felt like laughing now. If anything, the mention of Demetria had convinced him of his decision. There was no way in hell he would sell his soul to the devil, no matter how beautiful she might look. "Listen, Dad," he began, turning around. Afterwards, he realized it had been his fatal mistake. He never should have faced the old man. Instead of a proud and determined man, he found a desperate one who looked like he was in need of an injection shot of adrenaline. Chase felt his heart constrict in dismay. He could not do this. He would not do this. Although he had never fallen in love in his life, he knew there was no way in hell he was going to fall for someone like Demetria, or even like her enough to coexist with her for the rest of his life. "Father," he repeated, sounding less convincing even to himself, "I cannot marry someone just for the sake of a merger between two families." He hated the way his voice wavered. It was not out of weakness. It was mostly because he felt emotional. He knew what it was taking his father to ask something from him, his self-sufficient dad. Chase had never refused his father anything. Until now. "I see." 2 words, spoken so coldly that Chase flinched at the tone, but the prospect of a lifetime punishment with Demetria was too horrifying to even consider. At that particular moment, he hated Demetria even more than he could have imagined, hated her for being rich and superficial, hated her for being the one available for this catastrophe, even if he knew she was not at fault for his own father's thinking. "In that case, I will require you to resign from the board," instructed Peter Landon, ever the businessman. His father, it would seem, had regained his original meanness. Chase would have laughed if it had not been such a serious situation. His father was no different from the rich he hated so much, a fact he was vastly aware of but could not do anything about it, since Peter was his parent. What does Mother have to say about this? Chase ventured foolishly, hoping that his other parent would jump in his defense and stop the nonsense they were calling an arranged business deal. Peter seemed surprised. "Your mother?" he queried incredulously. Like this was something he had not even contemplated announcing to a mother, that he was considering marrying her son off to a complete stranger. "I haven't even asked her about it," he finally snapped, getting over the question. "Would it make a difference if your mother agreed to this merger?" Would it? Chase found himself asking the same question before his father had even formulated it. No, of course it wouldn't. Fiona Landon was a weak woman, one who was so desperate to please her philandering husband that she had completely lost herself in the process. So, favoring her children over her spouse was definitely out of question. "Dad, think about it. Who would take over the company with me gone?" Chase felt no qualms about leaving his father's company. Not for the money, and definitely not for the opulent life it had given him. He was humble enough to have appreciated the privileged life while it lasted. However, he was a man of various gimmick, and he would forge his way back to the top. "I'm going to hand the enterprise over to Eva," his father announced with almost a sneer in his voice. Chase gasped in shock, something which happened rarely as he was not so easily flustered. Eva Landon was his youngest sister, who was still studying law in college, and she was the worst person suitable for the job. Chase had believed that his dear daddy would have summoned one of his sons back, but now he knew better. Peter was too proud to call them back, not after they had left one by one. But Eva, she was too young to shoulder such a huge responsibility. "Has she agreed to it?" he asked, filled with trepidation at the thought of his sister being gobbled by the sharks he was used to dealing with. A protective feeling sprung inside him, and before he could help it, he knew he would never allow such a fate to fall on Eva. "She does not have a choice," Peter threw in nonchalantly, standing up, clearly dismissing the whole subject as closed. It was modus operandi of his father anyway. Using anyone to his benefit, not caring who he was hurting in the process. Like he believed it would be best if Chase married a rich heiress, not even stopping for 1 second to consider what impact it might have on Chase. Or that he was ousting him from his company, not caring that his only son was already out of his life, and if he left his company, he would lose him forever. Chase was the only fool who cared about being tossed so carelessly out of their lives. If history was witness enough, he knew that his father would not think twice before executing his plan. He had not cared when Dylan had wanted a career in music instead of law. He had not cared when Liam had fallen in love with a poor waitress. Similarly, he would not care if Eva had to drop out of school before even finishing her law degree, something she had not even wanted to do. As soon as his father was out of his office, he dialed his sister's number to inquire about her. Eva was the only one who still talked to him like he was someone worthy of love. His brothers had believed him to be cowards, since he had not had the courage to leave their father when he had the opportunity, except that they had conveniently forgotten that he had been the eldest and had been the one to cater for them when they had needed him. It was true that he had never defied his father for them, but he had never forbidden them from pursuing their dreams. If he had taken off like they had done, none of his brothers would have been able to pursue their lives like they had wanted. They would have been a pawn to their father, like he had always been. "Eva," he rasped as soon as she picked up. "How are you, my baby girl?" "Chase?" she cried instantly, making him forget his fugitive brothers. "What a surprise. Dad called me today and asked me if I could come back home. There was uncertainty in her voice, like she was suspecting something was terribly wrong. He remained silent and pressed his 2 forefingers on his eyelids, unable to tell her that he was going away too. How could he tell her youngest sister that he had finally taken his decision of moving away from the so-called family? "Chase," she urged in a husky voice, "you're scaring me. Tell me what happened." Chase cleared his throat. It felt constricted, like he was going to choke any moment. It was now or never. "I'm going," he said, in a husky voice, knowing that somehow Eva would understand what he meant. There was no need to elaborate. Eva was close to at least other 3 brothers who'd left the family, and he was sure that by now she must already know the loaded meaning of that one short sentence. It meant that they had had enough of their tyrant father. As expected, she picked up the cue perfectly. "No, Chase, not you too. Tell me what he did. That bastard," Eva cried, her voice wobbly with consternation and grief. He hated himself for inflicting this on her. "I have no choice, honey," he said after a while, not knowing what to tell her, which would sound lesser than it already was. The truth was, he was giving up on her, giving up on the family. He would never forgive his father for this, for breaking them apart. "No," she said in a horrified voice. I can't, she said between sobs. Please, she added, after getting a hold on her emotions. Don't leave me. I would not be able to live with him, with her, with them. Chase cleared his throat. He wanted to ask her to come with him, but first he had to be sure of her choice. "Father is thinking of nominating you to be one of the directors," he ventured, wishing she would be ecstatic about the job so that he would finally be free. "What?" she shrieked, sounding even more dismayed, making Chase feel like punching his father for the second time that day. "Are you serious? This is so not fair. After you have worked your ass off for that damned company?" Chase let out a mirthless laugh. It was futile going over that. If Peter had no second thoughts about disowning his last heir, there was no way he would feel bad about his hard work. "It does not matter." Like hell it doesn't. What does he want from you?" Instinctively, Chase knew if he disclosed that last piece of information, Eva would never forgive their father. As far as he was concerned, he had no money on his own. If he took Eva, how the hell would he manage her education as well as his business? He was going to start from scratch, and with his sister tagging along with him, it would be almost impossible. He refused to put her in some vulgar motel, like some cheapskate. Then a more horrifying thought stuck him. What if Peter forced Eva to marry some perverted tycoon, just to ensure his lineage in the world he wanted? It was unthinkable. Suddenly marrying Demetria Hilton seemed a lesser penitence than throwing his only sister to the dungeons. "Nothing. I've been thinking about moving away long enough," he lied, forcing lightness into his voice when all he wanted was to haul his frustration to someone who would understand. She let out a loud breath. "Chase, you scared the hell out of me. I thought that monster was up to something," she scolded him, while he reeled under the accuracy of her words. If only she knew. I'm ready to start my new business, and I think it's time for me to move on with my life. Be on my own for a while." He tried to be casual, knowing that Eva would never allow him to go, not without a solid reason anyway. "Of course you should. There's no need to go off to another continent like your brothers, though. You can start your business in Philly, and I promise I will come back to help you as soon as I'm done here." Chase muttered something inarticulate, gulping down his real feeling as he felt the noose tighten around his neck. He was well and truly trapped. Peter Landon was in for a surprise, though. Chase would negotiate everything else on his terms now. If he had to give up his freedom, it would not be for nothing. He would make sure that his father never had the upper hand to corner him in such a way again. If he had no other choice than going to the slaughter, altar, whatever, He would go his way. Chapter 2. No More Illusions. Demetria sighed as she caught sight of herself in the full-length mirror in front of her. Her wedding dress was perfect. She had been the one to design it with the help of her stylist, even if her mother had disapproved. The latter had wanted something which would turn her into a white fountain, but Dem had refused to look ridiculous on her wedding day. Instead, she had chosen a simple floor-length skirt because she had wanted to keep tradition, having included only one layer. It looked more like a simple evening gown, with the floral lace applique so delicate that the final outlook was exquisite. She had kept her hairdo to a minimum, with a bun at her nape decorated with small pearls. Even if she was not wearing any veil, it gave her a natural look, the outcome portraying her lovelier than she actually was. Glad that she had declined the excess makeup her personal makeup artist, Sophia, had insisted upon, she meticulously removed the fake eyelashes, taking extreme precaution not to smudge her mascara. Usually, she was used to the heavy layers of makeup covering her skin and features, but not today. Today she wanted to be more herself than Demetria, the heiress. Everything else would be outrageous anyway. The venue and menu would be grandiose, even if they had little money to spare for such frivolous expenses, as from tomorrow onward they would no longer be lacking in wealth, thanks to the Landons. Dem could not help the cynical smile that marred her ethereal look as she continued to contemplate her reflection. Fate had intervened to teach her father a bitter lesson. The very folks whom her father had always mocked were now his savior. The Landons had always been the outcast of their society, and their only sin was that they had not been born rich. She could remember every time her father had jumped at an opportunity to make them feel lesser using jargons that had not yet come to terms. The Landons had been quick learners, though, especially Peter Landon. He was a shark, quickly grasping the fickle nature of their world, and made himself as chameleon as the others. Now, because of a deal which had failed with one of her father's previous partners, they had lost a colossal amount of money. Even if they were not on the verge of bankruptcy, William Hilton would never allow such a dent in his finance. Therefore, the arranged marriage. Dem had long ago discovered that she would eventually marry for money. With two parents as voracious as hers, there had never been scope for anything else. It had all been clear to her that her life was already set in a certain pathway, and she had no other options than to follow through. A long time ago, when she still had her ideals about herself and her life, she had believed that she would be able to break away from the golden cage. As soon as she had turned 18, she had made plans to leave the nest, to fly with her own wings. She had then believed that she would finally be free. However, she had underestimated the capacity of William and Bethany Hilton. They were very influential people who would stop at nothing to have their only daughter provide them what they expected of her. She was a robot, they ordered, and she delivered. So when her parents had made the announcement that her wedding was planned in 2 months, she had not been surprised. Not really. After that fateful event 6 years ago, she had no illusions about her parents. They would expect her to bend to their every whim, since according to them, she was an overprivileged child. What had surprised her was the fact that her father had been willing to accept Chase Landon as his son-in-law. She shuddered at the thought of her future husband. Dem considered him the most obnoxious man in her circle, since he had a habit of saying what went through his head. Curiously enough, she preferred him to the other prospective grooms her parents had been showcasing to her over the past year. Not that she had refused any of them. No, she did not have that luxury. Luckily for her, nothing concrete had been decided. Until now. At least Chase was no hypocrite like those other spoiled brats. He still had that raw appeal to him, which Dem presumed must stem from his previous life. Manners aside, the man was hot as hell. According to the tabloids, he had an Italian background from his maternal grandmother, which gave him a sexy allure. Dem had seen her friends swoon over him enough to know he had a heart of stone and that he still resented the fact that he had been poor. Something which was of bad taste to her, since she personally thought that there was no shame in coming from a modest background. Money was so capricious anyway that it could change the best of man. Like her father at present. Suddenly, the Landons had become more precious than gold when only a month ago he was still considering them as dirt. She had no idea whether the Landons had felt her father's mean attitude or any of the others. One thing she was sure of it was that Chase did not fit the pack of her society. Dem had no idea what to expect of Chase and what he expected of her in return. She knew that everybody believed her to be spoilt rotten, and frankly that was the way she kept it. Except her associates from her charitable activities, which she made sure were altruists, not interested in making the headlines. Nobody knew her real nature. She could fake anything, a smile, a tear, even pain. Nobody had picked anything from her except on that fateful night when Chase had called her out on the plastic smile accompanied with the empty apology she had given him that had made her ashamed of herself, like she always was. Since then, she had avoided Chase Landon at every social event, something which had proven to be easy since he had never bothered to be near her, not even when they had been out with their mutual friends. It had suited her just fine. Except she had always felt a pang when he had smiled at her friends to greet her with cold, frosty looks that could freeze hell over. It was not fair. Her socialite friends were even more artificial than she was, but since avoiding him had been at top of her list, she'd never bothered defending herself. Given the way he made her feel, it had been the safer option to take. For she knew that during the parties, she had always been aware of him as he had been aware of her. It was too obvious, the way they were very careful not to let their eyes clash, or retain each other's gaze for too long, or the way they avoided the merest touch. Dem swallowed hard and sighed again. Finally, she became aware of some girls fluttering around her to arrange her dress, some sighing with envy. Arrogantly, she looked down on them, knowing that they thought she was venerating herself. She smiled inwardly. Let them think she was vain enough to admire herself for so long. Why wouldn't they? She was raised in a household where vanity was celebrated. Nobody would know that the reason she was staring at herself was because her head was in such a turmoil. She was too much an expert at hiding her real feelings. She just wished she could skip meeting her mother before walking down to the hall. Somehow, she knew that it was not possible. Bethany would make sure to criticize everything about her, and Dem would listen with a benign smile like it did not affect her. However, it did. She just never showed anything. Like always, never letting on to her mother that she craved for a compliment or a few words of encouragement. Her mole, a beauty mark on the right corner of her lower lip, quivered as she felt the emotions taking toll on her. Unfortunately, her mother chose that perfect moment to enter her dressing room. The girls fluttered around to wrap up their tasks quickly, knowing that Mrs. Hilton would scold them if they did not finish what had to be done. As they left, she felt hope squeezing her heart. Maybe her mother would finally realize that Dem had spent her life pleasing her. It was futile. "Demetria!" she almost shrieked in horror. "Your dress looks so mundane." She finally finished her sentence, and Dem knew that Bethany had used the last word because she thought she should, being generous, on her daughter's wedding day. Dem did not take umbrage at her words. She had long learned that ignoring her mother was the best way to deal with her, so instead of replying, she shrugged. Nonchalance was the best weapon to use against her mother. If she gave the slightest inclination of caring, her mother would make a mountain of a molehill just to prove her wrong. "Where's father?" she asked after a moment of awkward silence. Their relationship had always been loaded with uncomfortable silences. They had little in common and would barely speak to each other unless strictly necessary. "He's waiting for you downstairs. Are you sure you don't want me to add a person?" Dem inwardly cringed in horror at the suggestion, her face remaining inordinately impassible. "I would love to, but we can't keep Father waiting," she said, knowing that her mother would never let go if she allowed her to see how much she was affected. Out of desperation, she was using her trump card. Her father hated waiting. "Yes, yes, of course. My poor darling, you look like a widow instead of a bride." Finally, she took offense at her mother's lack of tact. It was something she should have been used to by now, despite the fact that Bethany had a real talent at hurting her. Without a word, she turned away from the mirror and exited the room, not even caring if her mother was following her or not. Stupid tears pricked her eyes. She had to blink several times to hide them away, her eyelashes flushing mildly so as not to mess her makeup. An action she was so used to that she could hardly remember when she'd cried for real, not since a long time anyway. Her father was even worse. He was typing furiously on his BlackBerry and did not even bother to look up when she reached the top of the staircase. Slowly, she descended the steps one by one, praying that her other parent would turn out less cruel. She vowed to herself that if he looked at her with a tender emotion in his eyes, she would forgive all his sins and play the ideal daughter all her life. When she reached the last step, her father did not even put out his arm like tradition demanded, while Dem had to follow him feeling foolish at her wishful thoughts. The church was crowded with lots of people. Dem suddenly felt very nervous as thousands of questions tumbled in her head. A sense of irrational panic gripped her, something rare, since she was used to being showcased like a trophy ever since she was a little girl. What if she fell down in front of so many people? What if the groom decided at the last minute to cancel the farce they were trying to label as a wedding? It would not be impossible, as she had not even met him after the wedding had been announced, not even once. Dem had no clue what Chase thought about them being married. She was wise enough, though, to deduce that Peter Landon must have placed a gun at his temple. There was no way Chase would have agreed to get married to her otherwise. So what if he had finally found a way to break through his father's hold on him, whatever it was? She gulped down her worry, her plastic smile not fading for even a millisecond. Her eyes stayed glued downwards, as she was too scared to check if the groom was there. Her father was so insensitive that he would not care anyway, only mourning his monetary loss. She stopped walking when her father stopped, her ears yearning for a hint of what was going on, and let a discreet breath of relief when nobody screamed, "Scandal." There was absolute silence. Dem found that she had no courage to look up at her groom, because she was too much a coward. She was too afraid of what she would see in his beautiful blue eyes. Disgust, contempt, or hate. Those were the emotions which had always been present on the rare occasions she had allowed her eyes to meet his. Normally, when she read the emotions of abnegation in his eyes, she always felt curiously detached, like she was distinctly separating the cold woman she portrayed and the actual person she actually was. Would she be able to conjure the same indifference today? As a bride, she found herself hoping foolishly that a miracle might have happened, that somehow Chase was marrying her because he had suddenly grown fond of her. Not even her wildest dreams would she dare wish that he was crazily in love with her, but she found herself wishing that their marriage would stand a chance. Finally, she looked up. Excruciating disappointment filled her. Chase was not even looking at her. He was looking in the direction of one of the guests, and Dem was too humiliated to care in whose direction it was. Quickly, she bent her head again, feeling mortified that her groom was not even interested in looking at her. It was worse than she could have imagined. It felt like the earth had tilted under her feet, and she suddenly realized that marrying for money had ensured that she would never be loved all her life. It was like living with her parents all over again. Her mother not caring about hurting her feelings on her damned wedding day. Her father not even looking at his only daughter when he was giving her away. Now her groom, not even interested in knowing how she looked, even if it was a marriage of convenience, he could have the sensitivity to at least look at her, to feign some modicum amount of interest with the female he was going to spend his life with. Then Dem scolded herself. Hadn't she always wanted the pretense to end? Hadn't she craved for living her life with real feelings, even if it was hate, instead of making futile attempts to be polite and caring? In spite of her brave front, she could not help feeling bad when the only emotion she could raise in her groom was indifference. As she stood beside Chase, the minister started his preaching, and the words were not even making sense. For the first time in her life, Dem felt a weakness which was wrenching her soul. Feeling a bout of self-pity, she wanted to howl at her destiny. How was it possible that she had so much money but was so poor in other things which mattered more, like relationships, friendship, love? Despite the maelstrom of emotions which racked her, she stood still with her back straight as she endured another punishment from life. She could hardly blame Chase for her misgivings. He was only doing what had been asked of him. It was not his fault that the sight of herself in such a beautiful wedding gown had messed up her head. She was not supposed to be having romantic feelings about the groom, or hopeful insight about her marriage. Hers would be no different from that of her parents. It would be based on a mutual unspoken understanding. She would do her duty, make a good wife, pretending to be content with her domestic obligation. Pretending not to notice when her husband was away, inevitable taking a few mistresses time and again, pretending not to care when her husband flirted with other beautiful women in front of her, pretending to be involved in his life in front of others while in their privacy, their lives would be completely separated. She would not interfere with his, and he would not ask her questions in turn. There would be no real interaction except when absolutely necessary, since she would be considered a nuisance if she were to offer her opinion. Often in her teenage days, she had wondered how her mother could tolerate such an awful treatment. Then at 18, she'd discovered that even Bethany was not the person she had thought she was. Her mother, Bethany, was as much to blame as her father. She also had a separate life with a few lovers of her own. Of course, she was discretion personified when it came to hiding her unfaithfulness. Not even the press would get a whiff of her mother's activities, and when she got back home from her social trips, she was as radiant as ever, getting back into the role of Mrs. Hilton. Dem was sure she would eventually learn to play the role of Mrs. Landon as well. It would be tough to adapt at first, but then she was a pro at pretending. She would just consider herself as a heroine who had been casted with a new role and would have to work hard in order to get into the character. After all, Demetria Hilton was a fake. Demetria Landon was also just an illusion. It was no big deal. Now that she had no illusions left, she managed to convince herself that it was no big deal. Like she had done so far, she would survive that ordeal as well, alone. She was strong and needed no one to be her support, and finally, she was able to look up. She was now in control of her emotions. In dismay, she realized that it was the exact moment the minister announced that the groom might kiss the bride. All that pep talk evaporated as she found her new gathered wits shattering again. Would he humiliate her now? To herself, she acknowledged that no matter how the kiss presented, she would feel humiliated anyway. So, when she finally looked into the dim blue-gray pools facing her, she made sure her gray eyes were filled with no emotions at all, giving him the blandest look, that her trademark fake smile was plastered on her poker-faced face. She knew the exact second when her artifice found its mark. She felt more than saw his jaws clench in anger, and felt curiously satisfied for having gauged a reaction from him. Good for him. If he wanted a fake wedding, he would have to bear with a fake wife as well. After all, there was nothing real in her marriage, she forced to remind herself before pouting a little to show him that she was waiting for his kiss. Even when Chase bent to peck at her lips, she could feel the tension in his body. It was as rigid as a metal, and she retreated as soon as she could. It had been the barest flitter, and she had not even felt his lips. It was all she would allow. Every guest knew the reason why they were getting married anyway. There was no need to extend the charade too far. One fleeting second, before she averted her eyes again, she saw something in her groom's eyes, something akin to bewilderment. It was so quick, though, that Dem shrugged it aside, blaming it on her current oversensitive feelings. Finally, after posing for hundreds of photos as they were making their way to the venue where the reception was located, the paparazzi cleared away, giving her some time to breathe. Her groom did not comfort her, as he must be assuming that she was used to the press, which in truth, she was. How does one get used to strangers probing one's personal life so ruthlessly, though? She would never be comfortable with the media, although she never showed it. As they waved to the people behind, Dem felt her courage slip away when Chase asked her if it would be all right if she went first and he would follow with his sister behind. She was horrified at having to arrive at her own wedding ceremony alone without her groom. She knew the drill. Unloved wives did not cling. It would make an ugly scene and give the vulture reporters an opportunity to trash her life. So she smiled and felt a perverse pleasure as she saw Chase flinch. It was almost funny how he could guess how fake her smile was every time. He reacted to her fake smile like it was something which hurt him personally. Dem had never met anyone who could recognize her duplicity so unerringly, except him. "Of course," she muttered, picking up her dress on the graveled pathway, making her way towards the awaiting car, her back rigid with pride. When she walked away from him, the hairs on her neckline tingled, and she sensed a powerful force beckoning her, but she did not turn around. Then, unable to resist any longer, just before she got in, she turned around to find Chase standing where she'd left him, wearing a peculiar expression like he was trying to figure her out. Maybe he was feeling bad about leaving her alone. She should know better. She had just signed a lifetime of loneliness. Dem had a feeling it was only the beginning. Without a word, she whirled round and got inside the limo where she finally allowed a single tear to trickle down her right cheek.